Hello and welcome to episode 75 of the Chills of Will podcast. Happy to be joined by a hometown legend from Sacramento as well, and that's Marcos Bretón. Marcos Bretón's Sacramento Bee writer page says that he is, quote, connecting the dots on issues, people, and news in the Sacramento region, unquote. He is a journalist and columnist who was awarded the Guillermo Martinez-Marquez Award by the National Association of Hispanic Journalists for Fields of Pain, a series of stories about the exploitation of migrant farm workers in California. He's a veteran journalist with more than 30 years of experience covering California. The son of Mexican immigrants, Breton is married and is the father of two daughters. He's worked at the Bee since 1989, first as a news reporter, then as a sports columnist, then as a news columnist. He was recently named the McClatchy Company's new California opinion editor. Marcos, hello. And that cannot possibly be right that you've been writing for 30 years. You're only, what, 37?
Yeah, I wish that
Man.
were the case. I wish that were the case. More and more now, I'm running into people who are professionals. They're out in the working world. You know, they have homes of their own. They have children of their own. Who would say the words, "I grew up reading you," and so it's where I am in my life's journey right now. The time has gone by very quickly, and I never intended to be in Sacramento for the sum of my professional career, but that's the way it has worked out to my benefit, and I'm I'm blessed to be here.
Well, yeah, I would say, I was a little older, but I grew up reading you as well. But, and that's definitely a compliment. And you've always written lovingly yet honestly about Sacramento and about California. And, we'll talk a lot about your sports specific writing and all the different types of writing in just a couple minutes. San Jose. I'm happy to have my maternal family from San Jose. You grew up there. Just kind of wondering what it was like as far as language went. Were you a monolingual English speaker? Did you hear Spanish and respond in English? Kind of like, what was your relationship with being bilingual or monolingual as a kid?
So my father, Reynaldo Breton, he passed away a while ago, but he was a very proud Mexican man, and he insisted that my brother Rodrigo and I hold on to our Spanish, and it was a battle for him. And fortunately, I'm glad that he was stubborn and insisted, because being able to speak Spanish opened up many wonderful career opportunities for me, and added depth to my work that was invaluable. And luckily, I'm proud to say that I communicated that to my dad while he was still living. And he kind of looked at me and said, "I told you so," which was very funny. And that was who he was. But so yeah, I grew up in an immigrant household. My parents were both from Mexico. Even though my mother was American born and a dual citizen, she grew up in Mexico. Her whole family was there. My whole family was there. My dad's whole family was there. And so I didn't realize it at the time, but I do now. So I grew up in California, Northern California, in the late 70s. And it was at a time of that there were things that were happening in my life that didn't make sense then that do make sense now. That I felt that I didn't know where I fit. I didn't know where I fit. Was I American? Was I Mexican? There were a lot of, as it was the 70s and the 80s were kind of explosion in immigration from Mexico to the United States, and so I would say my experience, our experience, those of us who are Mexican American, particularly growing up in California, we have a different experience than our Italian friends, than our Irish friends, because while we do assimilate, the next wave of people keep coming, and it creates pressure points for you, because then you know, as we know, politically, politicians use the issue as a wedge, and so the whole wetback, beaner, illegal, all of those phrases were spoken in my presence, and so you end up on the defensive, as it were, and so that was my and so again, it didn't make sense to me then. It does now. That I was growing up when the demographics of the state were changing rapidly, and there was a lot of political pushback and fallout, and so you end up being in the line of fire, as it were, even if you're born here, because even if you're born here, you have to accept a certain amount of negativity and hostility towards people who share your same background, and then you're having to make these horrible choices of, you know, which side am I on? Am I on a side? So I struggle with that as I grew up. I struggle with it, and I've written about it. I can talk about it now. That I was at one time. I'm not embarrassed about it anymore. But at one time, I did the Spanish route. You know, I'm because and I look back on it now. I know why I did it. You just get tired of the cracks, the comments, the condescension. And so I look at that now, and those were all very formative experiences for me of looking at the world like you're feeling like you're on the outside looking in. And I don't mean to make that sound grim or what. I had a lovely childhood. We didn't have much money. We were an immigrant family. Our big thing every year was at Christmas time, we would drive to Mexico, northern Mexico, and spend Christmas with my family. And so I think all those experiences were formative for me and shaping my worldview. And then journalism became like a natural outgrowth of that. As you're an observer, you're sort of analyzing your situation, and I was sort of forced to understand why the politics were such in the 70s and the 80s, and it was part of the whole tough on crime period, part of the whole, you know, gang task force period. There were very few you know, role models that you could look at in television or in mainstream media, or so you grow up with all these images. Because in my case, I was very proud of my parents, and very proud of my ethnic background, very proud of the, you know, my parents came here with nothing, and they made a home for themselves. They paid their taxes. They raised two good kids who become productive citizens in the world. And that's what immigrants do. That's what immigrants have always done. But that narrative was hijacked, particularly hijacked. Well, I mean, it's now that I've become more aware of the history, it's been the case for a long time. But when you're in the middle of it, when you're growing up in the household where, you know, the most important people in the world to you are from a different country, and you're from this country, you have to navigate all of that. And I think all of those experiences led me to being a journalist.
Wow, that's very interesting. I appreciate your perspective. You know, that's reason number 970,000 why we need something like critical race theory, right? Why we need like a true history. And not...
I mean, you know, I've watched that with amusement, that whole debate, because I've reflected a lot in the last couple of years. Well, yeah, in the last couple of years, particularly, that, you know, what I learned in history class at San Jose High School was the Reader's Digest version,
right.
of our state history, of our regional history, and so as a journalist, I embrace the complexity of the story, and unfortunately, it's true that newspapers played a role in trying to give the official line as opposed to asking questions. And so a lot of newspapers, including the one that I currently work at and have worked at for the majority of my career, were complicit in marginalizing communities.
Sure.
And there's a reckoning now going on about that. And I listen, in the time that I've been at the Sacramento Bee, I worked for people who really tried to change that narrative, and who I was hired as part of a process to change that narrative. And I was part of a generation in the early 90s, as strange as it sounds, that my generation at the Sacramento Bee, we really integrated, ethnically and racially integrated the newsroom fully in the early 1990s. There had been people of color in my newsroom before I got here in 1989, but they were small in number, and they had not begun to ascend to positions that are competitive and valued and sought after. And so my generation was part of that. And was that process easy? No, it was not. No, it was not. But it happened. And, I laugh because I have readers who they are very critical of me on the issues of race and critical race. There was one gentleman who wrote to me when I was promoted to this current position, and his line was like, "Wow, this is such a racist country that you could get promoted to this position," and it made me laugh. It made me laugh. And this particular gentleman, he and I go back and forth all the time. But those are there are some folks who don't want to touch on the parts of our history that are not glorious and I think that looking at it all, being a patriotic American, looking at it all, are not mutually exclusive. Not everyone feels that way, and there are certainly some states like Texas that are, the government is getting involved, and there are teachers who are paying a price for trying to expand the minds of their students, and that reluctance to want to look straight at the arc, as it were, and not avert our eyes. It plays out in a lot of ways. Like yesterday, or I'd rather say on Sunday the 18th, I watched the European Soccer Championships with a group of guys, some of whom I knew, some of whom I didn't. All very successful people in their chosen fields, and so at the end of the game, England lost in penalty kicks, and the 3 English players who missed their penalty kicks were all Black. And so, in the moment, I thought, I know what's going to happen. These guys are going to get crushed and that's exactly what happened. And so I was on this string, about 18, 19 guys who we all watched. Some of them attended, some didn't. And so on this string last night, I posted a tweet from one of the, I think it was the BBC, or that the Prime Minister was calling out the racists who were just saying and writing horrible things about these players on social media, and I put it on this string, and 5 people immediately left the conversation.
Wow. Wow.
And one guy who I don't know who it was, as soon as my tweet hit the string, he take me off the string. And then he took himself off, and 4 other people. So these things are real, and I'm of the mind that we shouldn't look away from that. We need to take it on because we have it in the past.
Wow, that anecdote is so telling, huh? Man.
Yeah.
Like you can literally see that they have left the conversation. Yeah.
They just dropped within minutes. Within minutes. So
man. Going back to what you were reading as a kid, and you talked about, this idea of like some of the people who are most important to you in your life are from another country, and you're Mexican or Mexican American. We'll talk about that in a minute, how you kind of identify that way. Have you read the book Pocho by Villarreal?
I haven't. I have not read it.
It actually takes place mostly in Santa Clara Valley. It's such an incredible book. I mean, not being a Pocho myself, not being the child of immigrants, it still hit me, just this idea of living in 2 worlds,
I'm a Pocho.
Right. And so
I totally am.
I was going to ask you a two-part question is, one, I know that for some that's an offensive pejorative term, kind of how you see that and how you saw that as a kid, I guess, just this idea of living in these 2 or multiple worlds,
Well, I saw it. I saw it this way: that I was in contact with people who were Mexican and who took a dim view of Pochos like me, because our Spanish was not flawless, and so I realized that if I said the word out loud, particularly in front of a Mexican national, that the same thing would always happen. The person will burst out laughing hysterically, and then realize that I'm not embarrassed by it, and then they would get embarrassed. And it's because we Mexicans and Mexican Americans, there's traditionally been tension between the groups where we're those of us on this side of the border. It's like, whose side are you on? Who are you? And there's a saying like, you're neither from here nor from there. I've had members of my own family say that to me with complete conviction, and I would correct them and say, no, I'm from there. I'm from the United States. I'm still proud of who I am, despite what you're saying to me right now. But it's interesting to me that it's not just our culture; it's a lot of cultures. The human beings seem to need to have people that they can look down upon, and so that's been the case. I often. Particularly when you're speaking to someone from Mexico who's from a wealthy background, educated background, and the same thing happens to me all the time. I will say something to them in Spanish, and they will respond to me in English, and it's almost as if they're saying to me, your Spanish is so remedial, I'm not going to lower myself to converse with you in Spanish, so I'm going to answer you in English. These things don't bother me anymore. It's just the way it is. It's just the way it is. I choose to, I know who I am, that I'm an American of Mexican descent, and I talk about that, and because I feel like my family and my experience is an antidote to the negative political rhetoric out there. My parents came here and worked hard, and they built a home, they raised children, they paid their taxes, they were good neighbors, they cared about their community. And it was their vitality and the vitality of people like them who have really revitalized communities up and down California.
Mm-hmm.
And so like the word pocho, when I started feeling better about these things when I took ownership of who I was, and ownership of my experience in California, finding my way, just like a lot of us have found our way. Our story is different from others. And the older I've gotten, the more I've sort of chafed at the Latino label, because my outlook and experience is so much different from. I've traveled to Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic and South America. They're night and day. They really are. We share a common language and some common characteristics, but that's where it ends. And so a lot of my writing has been very specific to my ethnic group, the largest ethnic group in California, and our particular history within it, which is still evolving, and I'm still trying to wrap my own arms around. There's a lot of things that I've learned about my own ethnic experience that I didn't realize that never came up in high school history.
Sure. Based on other writers that I've talked to, I think I know the answer to this question, but I wonder, as a kid, did you see yourself represented, your culture, your subcultures, cultures plural? Did you see yourself represented in what you read?
No, not really. I was an English minor in college, and we read a lot of Faulkner and a lot of Hemingway and Stein. I mean, I love Steinbeck, and every now and then there would be like Mexican, but there would be peripheral characters in his narratives, and he was representing what California was at that time. But I loved his writing. It doesn't mean that you don't. I love it. I didn't really read anything that spoke to me until I began reading the essayist Richard Rodriguez in the early 1980s, and then I got to meet Richard in the early 90s. I haven't talked to him in a very long time. But that was when I first began to see my experience in the pages of a book that achieved some acclaim in popular culture. And then I've subsequently read other books, but it's been later in my life that this has happened. In high school. And in college, certainly that was not the case. My reading was very focused on it was very European centric and very much centered on an East Coast perspective on America, and I didn't. It's only been recently that I've been reading things that spoke to who I was when I was growing up.
Right. Well, yeah, I don't want to hold it against him, but Richard Rodriguez went to Christian Brothers High School, which is a rival of my school, Jesuit, but that's okay. That's okay. Another Sacramentan.
Yes.
So the name of the podcast is the Chills at Will podcast. So, getting into the work that you really identified with, that really spoke to you, who are some of those writers who give you chills at will, who, they thrill you every time you read them? What poems or stories or writers?
Well, Steinbeck was a big influence for me because he wrote about Northern California. And even though I grew up about an hour's drive from Salinas, his writing really spoke to me. I took his class in high school. We took this rickety old bus. And our high school class, it wasn't a school bus. It was a and they were identified as being like, ne'er-do-wells, and they were sort of and it was the way kind of Mexicans were portrayed in the pages of the San Jose Mercury News and on the newscasts, where it's mostly crime centered, and the group our teacher knew this. They were known as the mosquitoes, you know, and there were all these like hardcore cholos, and it turned out that they were just like really nice guys who seemed very familiar to me once I was influenced by the way that they were portrayed. And so when I'm riding on the Mosquitoes bus over the hill to go to Salinas, like these guys seem pretty nice to me, you know. And so going to Cannery Row and that whole experience, it was a real revelation for me that Steinbeck could write really compelling narratives based on a part of the world that, you know, was familiar to me, and he had a real empathy,
yes,
for his characters, and he was very journalistic in the way he viewed the world, the way he wrote about it, and so that was a major influence to me. And I learned to read the newspaper because my mother was an avid reader of the paper. And in those years, the Mercury News was an afternoon paper. So she would get the afternoon paper and read it from cover to cover. That's how she learned how to speak English, was reading a newspaper. So I began reading the newspaper because of her. And they would have, you know, I was a big sports fan at that time, less so now, but at that time, you know, sports writing was very compelling to me, and I got a Sports Illustrated subscription in 1975 for my mother, and so, you know, Ron Fimwright and Steve Wolfe and Curry Kirkpatrick, and just really beautiful lyrical writers, and I couldn't wait to get home on Friday afternoons, and the magazine would be there, and I would flip to the back, and there would almost always be a long form journalism piece in there. And that was the writing that I fell in love with, reading the Mercury News, reading the Sporting Green and the Chronicle. And those writers were just, I mean, Ron Fimwright was from the San Francisco area, and he had worked for the Chronicle, and then he wrote baseball for Sports Illustrated. I just love the way he wrote, and so that was my inspiration. Then I read columnists, even though, you know, I came to feel differently about him later. Like they would run a lot of Mike Royko stuff in the Mercury News, and he was, you know, it's very Chicago, right, but a hard-hitting columnist who was just bare knuckled, and so that was appealing to me, that he had a point of view, and he was a personality in his own right. I never wanted to be that, but his fearlessness in writing, I think, was very appealing to me. And then I got older, and before I became a columnist, I was a big fan of Maureen Dowd with the New York Times, and loved the way she wrote. And she won a Pulitzer in the late 90s for just savaging Bill Clinton at the end of his second term. And but, you know, the thing with writing that's dangerous is that you can admire other writers, but you have to know who you are. I always tell this to young people. I was worried where I've known talented young writers who became subsumed in other people's work, and then had a difficult time moving beyond just imitation, you know. And so then I reached a point when I began writing a column where I began reading less of what other people were writing, because I stumbled on the idea that I felt like I was at my best when I was not self-conscious. That and it's a hard mind frame to get in, but I feel like you can't be worried about what other people are going to say, and you have to write even when saying something out loud frightens you, or you feel like it's going to be offensive to someone you like. And I learned that from Richard Rodriguez also. He wrote a book in the early 1980s called Hunger of Memory. And it was a very controversial book in its way. There were a lot of Mexican American folks who felt like he was betraying his culture and putting it down. And then when I read it, I didn't see that. I mean, he and I lived very similar experiences, and he was being honest. And he, as a lover of words, he felt like bilingual education was detrimental to Mexican American people. And I don't know if I fully agree with it now, but I'm a lot closer to agreeing with that now than I was some time ago, because I do think that you have to assimilate. And he said that out loud in the early 80s and took a lot of heat for it. And I didn't react that way to it. And I didn't jump on the bandwagon of people criticizing him. And I even got kind of defensive about him. And then when I met him, I realized he kind of liked it, that the business person side of him saw that was definitely a useful thing. So that was interesting to me. But the point was, I was raised by two immigrants who were very straightforward, who read, even though they weren't formally educated in the way that I would be, were very literate, and they read a lot, and they were very critical thinkers. And both my parents, especially my father, was honest to the point of being brutally honest. And I think that all those things eventually led me to opinion journalism, because I felt that that's the only way to be, and that if I was afraid to write something because of the way some people would react, then I shouldn't be doing this. And I would say that of anyone who's doing opinion journalism, if there's a topic that you feel that you can't touch on, then you probably shouldn't be doing this. And I do see a fair amount of people who have a column sig who are more like feature writers. And there's a place for that, I suppose, but that wasn't what I wanted to be.
Sure.
And that if I was going to do this, that it was going to have a perspective. And I can say, that my perspective is different from a lot of newspaper columnists in America, and I think that that's a good thing. And I think that's what diversity is all about.
Yeah, you're definitely a very singular voice. Was there a eureka moment or eureka moments when high school, college, or when you realize wow, I can do this? I'm a writer who people get not a rise out of, in a negative way, but people enjoy my work. People think and ruminate on my work.
Yeah, I didn't think about it that way. I felt like, the first several years of my career, I felt like I got knocked around like a ping pong ball, because I didn't have a point of reference. I was the first person in my family to graduate from an American university, so I didn't have a point of reference for the workplace that I was entering. And so my first 2 years at my hometown paper at San Jose Mercury News were interesting, because it was to my sensibilities, it was a very political newsroom, and I didn't know how to operate in that space. And I was very young, and I was very green, very rough, very raw, and I was trying to figure out who I was, where I fit, and how I could even do this job. So there were a lot of days where I would go home in those years where I didn't feel like I was being very successful. And then it was just sort of by happenstance that my wife, we were newlyweds at that time. We were both working in the Bay Area, and both of us were somewhat dissatisfied with our station in life at that time. And so we had a friend in Sacramento, so you should apply here. And we didn't give any more thought to it than that. And then, so I came to Sacramento, and I felt like it was a fresh start. And I had some experience under my belt. And then so I began, learning how to do this job. But it really wasn't until I worked on this series that you mentioned at the outset,
Mm-hmm.
Fields of Pain, which is 30 years ago this year. That was the game changer for me, because I paired up with just a tremendous reporter named Mike Wagner, who later went on to the LA Times.
Mm-hmm.
So smart, so talented. And they paired me up with him, and we were going to do a piece on farm workers in California. And this was sort of post the Cesar Chavez revolution. Cesar Chavez was still around, but the revolution had fallen off the front page, and had really been the great boycotts were a thing of the past. And California had gone conservative in the 80s, first with Pete Wilson, first with George Duke Machen, then with Pete Wilson. And a lot of the things that Chavez had built were being dismantled in real time. And so we did this piece, and I went out in the field, man. And I was out with a photographer named Gennaro Molina, brilliant photographer who's with the LA Times still to this day. And he and I went out and we found the stories that paired with Mike's dissection of California's shoddy regulatory system that really perpetuated the abuse of farm workers in California. And we had amazing art, and it was a 4-part series, and it had an overwhelming response to it when it came out in November of '91. And that was it. It's like, once I did that, I said, I'm never going back. This is the kind of work that I'm going to do. And I became a general assignment reporter, and I began doing stories that had to do with justice and poverty and race and culture, and that became my thing. And so it was when I began doing that type of work that I when I would go home at the end of the day, I felt like I did something today. And so I don't mean it to sound egotistical, but it has to come from you. And then particularly when you become an opinion writer, and people will flatter you for a variety of reasons in this job, and you just can't listen to that or pay attention to that. And I get a lot of hate mail, but I get a lot of great mail too. And I feel like to function in this job, I can't really pay much attention to either one, because if I do, then I start to become self-conscious. Then I start to try to write to fit a format or to fit an idea, and you have to follow the idea, I think, to land on what you think is the truth, no matter what it is. And so once I began getting success and my stories began going on the front page, and I was writing about things that I really cared about and moved me, and I moved beyond just the schlock that I was writing about, that's when it hit for me. And that was a long time ago.
There's a great quote online that you said, talking about the Fields of Pain series. You wrote, "It was like graduating. I went from doing generic stories to stories that really mattered."
Yeah, and that was it. And Mike Wagner really helped me see that this is the kind of work that you want to be doing. And that's when, so that happened to me. So 30 years, so I was 28. So I had spent like the first 5 or 6 years, trying to figure out how I was gonna do this. And it all came down to me being able to write in a way that interested my editors, and then that interested readers, and that interested me.
Yes.
And so that was better than going to graduate school, because instead of writing a paper that only a professor would see, I was part of this series that got a lot of acclaim and won awards, and we were very proud. I was very proud of that, and I can't believe it's been 30 years since then. And I didn't think that I would still be in Sacramento 30 years later, but that's all of that. All of it has worked out in ways that I never could have imagined, and it's been a real joyride for me.
Yeah. That's interesting that you talk about. That's very interesting, very illuminating, the idea of, I've heard people say, of course, they don't read their hate mail, but they don't read.
I read it.
Okay.
I read it.
Don't take
I
it
read
to
it to a point. Like, I don't read the comments online because not because they hurt my feelings, but because
What's the point?
Whatever. But it's just,
Uh-huh.
but I don't even, when I first got on social media, I used to engage, respond. I'd get angry. I would block people. And now it's like, it's Twitter, man.
Yes, yes.
It's Twitter. And unless someone is racist or homophobic or transphobic or, just really crude or whatever, profane, I don't block people anymore. I just, whatever. That's all part of it. But I can't take that to heart. Just like I can't take the praise to heart, really, because then I think that you start to lose yourself a little bit when you start paying attention to that too closely.
Right. So I wonder how many times you've read the reviews for like on Goodreads or Amazon for your books.
I did at the time. I haven't in a very long time.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I haven't done books in a very long time. But at the time, it was a rush. Of course, it was a rush. And when I first became a columnist, and the first couple of columns I wrote, were just like, it's an avalanche of emails and phone calls, because I was purposely being. I mean, I was writing what I believe, but I was writing it in the most provocative way possible. Like the lead to my very first sports column was, "I hate Pacific Bell Park," which is now Oracle Park. Now, if it were now, I would rephrase it, because I don't hate the park. But what I was getting at was that as beautiful as the park is, I wrote about how it would probably priced out families like mine. That I learned to love baseball because baseball. My father was a cannery worker in San Jose, and we had just one income, because when I was younger, he would let my mother work, even though she wanted to. So we didn't have very much money. So if we would have had to pay the prices that you have to pay now to go to a Giants game, I wouldn't have gone to Giants games. We wouldn't have been able to afford it. And so I was talking about that. But that column, and then remember the radio host, Ron Owens in San Francisco, he picked that whole thing up, and I was a whole segment. He didn't ask me to come on. And I listened in. I was listening. I parked in the driveway in my house, and I was listening. And all these people were just coming on. These people in San Francisco just ripping me. And I thought, it's kind of cool that a writer from Sacramento is getting this big of a charge out of people in San Francisco. Yeah. And so I did get a bit drunk with that in the beginning. But fortunately, I realized that if all I'm doing is throwing firebombs all the time, that people are going to get tired of it, and people will stop reading. And so there's a time and a place for that, but not every single piece.
Yes. So I was the big-eared kid that would wear the Dodgers hat to Old Candlestick Park and get yelled at and cussed out. So those were the good old days. Candlestick Park, right?
Yes and no. Yes and no. Because I had a really dear friend, and he wore it. We were at it was Candlestick Park still in the late 90s, and he was wearing a Dodger hat, and some kid punched him in the stomach. And we can laugh about it now, but it definitely was not funny at the time. And I can remember going to games where beer was flying and where people were fighting, and it was not cool. You shouldn't get beat up at the ballpark, and you should not be fearful. Totally. And it's kind of went in that direction for a while.
Yes. So you helped with the autobiography of Sammy Sosa, the away games mostly about Miguel Tejada, right?
Yeah.
And then Home is Everything. Is that based on the Life is Time? That's for kids, or that's a separate?
Yeah, that was a different type of a book, and we did rewriting that, and that was some photography that my partner Jose Villegas did. But that was the continuation. So the real book was the Away Games book. That was the book that began as a newspaper series for the Bee. And this is, I marvel at this now in the early 90s, where I say, I'm going to do a series from a Sacramento-based writer. I'm going to do a series on players from Latin America. And they said yes. Next thing I know, I'm on a plane to Puerto Rico, and we produced it, and we met our deadline. We produced it. It was very well read. And that was the basis for a book that I later sold to Simon & Schuster, so that I was able to sell one to a major publishing house. You know, it definitely was not one of their front list releases of 1999, but it did get published under the Simon and Schuster banner. It did get reviewed in the New York Times, and it did get very positive. It did get reviewed in Sports Illustrated and many other big publications, and so that was a major thing for me. But it was a work of journalism. It was definitely about baseball players, to be sure, but it was about where they came from, and I really felt that in the canon of baseball books, that the chapter about players from Latin America had never really been covered in depth, and there have been some since then, but our book, I think, really emphasized the experience. And so it took me a while to sell because I had to find a protagonist, and fortunately we found Miguel Tejada. And do I wish that the book had coincided with his most valuable player year? I do. We were 3 years early on that one, because 3 years later he became the MVP. But it was a real joyride, and I learned a lot about the publishing business. But I did get a book done, and it was a fantastic experience.
Yeah. So like the stats were that like in 93, Latinos replaced African Americans as the second most dominant race or ethnicity in the majors. 4 years old, but 2017, 27.4% of MLB players were Latinos.
Right.
And I would say probably right the majority from the Caribbean, if you include like Curacao, even in like Venezuela.
Yes.
What major differences or interesting things did you see in Latin American baseball? I think of like, a Cuban baseball game where they're chanting and cheering and stomping and playing the tambores like it's
yes.
Versus in America, people are checking their phones and and much more
yes.
debate. What are some of the examples of differences?
Well, so in Latin America, baseball is still a passionate pursuit, and it's still, even though basketball has made some inroads, baseball is still unrivaled in those countries. And the reason the baseball is so popular in those countries is they have their own traditions, and they obviously the game was passed on to them by Americans in the late 19th century, early 20th century, but they have their own traditions, and then the players themselves, particularly the ones who made a real impact in the major leagues, become frontline superstars in their own country. And I remember being with Sammy Sosa in 2000. Wow. That was at the height of his popularity before he had his fall from grace, and I felt like I was with Michael Jackson the whole time I was with him on the island, and he would travel in a motorcade. And in the time that I was doing that book, I was sort of reluctantly part of that whole entourage of people who would travel with him. And so it's very powerful to people in those countries to have one of their own really make it in the United States, because those countries have a very different relationship with the United States. In the 20th century, the United States occupied the Dominican Republic twice militarily. And obviously we have a very complicated relationship with Colombia, with Mexico, the mainland U.S. and Puerto Rico. That history to this day is still very complicated. Obviously with Cuba, and so baseball is like a language down there. It's a springboard to economic success like few other legal avenues are. And I witnessed all that, and so all those players come here, and I felt like in the 90s it was still a bit of a culture clash, where these guys would really struggle. Not that they don't now, but with the way that everyone's got cable TV now, and so these guys are arriving now with a lot more knowledge. Like the first time I went to the DR in 93, I really felt like I was going to the thirdest third world there was. And then by the time I'd gone, like a decade after that, you could see the explosion of investment, American investment in money, and people had become really Americanized in that country. And so I feel like that the Latin players have energized the sport and kept it relevant, and kept it global, and they've made a major contribution to the game, and that their experiences are. I felt like I was at the forefront of really, believing that being able to speak Spanish to them was important, and understanding where they came from. After our book came out, like within the next 5 or 6 years, all of a sudden you began seeing beat writers with Spanish surnames covering teams, which you never saw before. And there was a time there where I was being interviewed a lot about players from Latin America by baseball writers. And so I felt like my book contributed to that. And now you see the benefit of that. You see guys who are just major superstars who they know their worth, and they demand it. And it's not like it was when I first began researching the book, where particularly the first generations of Latin players, a lot of guys who are deceased now, 50s, 60s, and 70s, they felt really used and abused by the system and didn't really make much money. Now these guys are making so much money that they call their own shots, and all that has happened. Miguel Tejada is a rich man now. And I still talk to him every now and then. I can't believe he's middle-aged now, and he's got a grown son. And to me, he's still that teenage kid that I first met, who was sleeping on a dirt floor, and now he lives in a mansion in South Florida. I mean, that's amazing to me. And he was on a Hall of Fame trajectory. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. I was one of the few people who voted for him for the Hall of Fame. But his life has been a major success, and I think that the immigrants have enlivened the game the way they have the United States, and they've made great contributions, and fortunately they know their worth now, and they demand it, and that's a good thing.
Did you feel like the major leagues, maybe the 90s, that era that you talked about, maybe the second generation of players from Latin America, did you feel like the major leagues were like actively resistant or harsh towards them, or was more of just like a literal ignorance, like just not knowing enough, not being as educated?
It was literal ignorance, so it's levels, right? So I think when the Toronto Blue Jays and the LA Dodgers established academies in the Dominican in the 80s, that was a signal that some of the smarter teams in baseball had figured it out, that if you make this investment, that it was going to generate a huge return, and it did. And then baseball, this is the way it always is, just like with analytics, when the A's were at the forefront, at the time of Moneyball, when that came out, a decade before that, the Blue Jays and Dodgers, because of key people they had in their organizations, they came up with a simple plan that if we build a facility here with first-rate facility, and we bring in coaches, and we feed these guys, and we keep them here, so we can control their movements, we can control their influences, and then we also school them in English, rudimentary English, and that it'll give them a greater chance of succeeding. And it exploded. And Sammy Sosa was a part of that whole system, and Miguel Tejada was a part of that whole system. And name any successful player, Pedro Martinez, all these guys who are in the Hall of Fame now, they were a part of that. And I feel proud that I was as a writer, that I was the first person to write about that and to put that into context. And obviously the game has continued changing since then. And so now you see, where Sammy Sosa got, like, I forget what it was, like $1,500, $2,000 as a signing bonus. Wow. But Miguel Tejada got like $1,500. Laughable. It's laughable. Now you're seeing more and more of these players commanding major money.
Yeah.
uh, so so um, so all that is to the good, and I feel like that the Latin players have helped move the needle on this really backward culture within baseball, where you got to play the game the right way, respect the game, and all these like cultural enforcers in the game. And you're seeing more American players kind of adopting the attitude that more Latin players had, and I feel like that culture is starting to change as well.
Yeah,
and that the Latin players have played a role in that.
Very true. How did you get the Hall of Fame vote, and how long do you have it for? How does that work?
So in 2001, 2002 was the 2001. As part of my job, I was going to be writing a weekly baseball column. So I became a member of the Baseball Writers Association of America. So with that, you get a credential that's good for any stadium. You don't, when you have your own credential, you don't have to lower yourself and, get a daily. It's always like the people with the daily credentials who are sort of shunned to one side in the pecking order. And so I had my own credential. So you have to have that credential for 10 consecutive seasons, and then you get the Hall of Fame vote. And it used to be that you would get the vote for life, but that changed in the steroid era, when they changed it to if you haven't written baseball for 10 consecutive seasons, then you lose the credential. So I'm about 4 or 5 years away from losing my vote, which is fine. Having the vote, my first vote coincided with the first steroid class. And so now I'm part of a group of voters every January who get called morons by sports talk radio hosts. And then every year I have at least one sports talk radio host who wants to have me on to talk about how he should have the vote instead of me. And I stopped saying yes to that a long time ago. So I'll have the vote for about 4 or 5 more years, and then I'll cycle out, and that's fine.
Yeah. I mean, obviously it's incredible. And I think always, or most of the time, you publicize your votes, right, in your articles.
Yes, always.
Which is very cool. But man, I don't envy you for having it during the steroid era. I mean, I don't know, I guess I'm just kind of thinking out loud, but I mean, how do you rate, like, someone like Ty Cobb was in the Hall of Fame, like a virulent racist.
Yeah.
And then what do you do with Bonds? What do you do with, all those guys from that era? I wonder kind of how you rate, like, their performance versus their actions. I don't know.
So I've done something that I didn't think that I would do, because when I was writing sports columns about Bonds, I was very critical of him. But when it came time for me to have my vote, which was the first year that he was eligible, I decided, after a lot of reflection, I decided that I did not want to be part of a process that exacted justice after the fact. That he was not punished in any way by baseball. He was a member in good standing. His record still stood despite everything else, and that I was not going to do that. And so I voted for him and Roger Clemens every time, and that they're very respected colleagues of mine who feel differently. And in the first couple of years, there was quite a bit of snark talk between writers on Twitter, and I never wanted to participate in that. And we have a disagreement. And the thing with this particular issue is that you're never going to solve it.
No,
because particularly like McGuire, Sosa, Bonds, those guys were never punished, and there weren't even rules to regulate steroids until they were far along in their journeys. And so, how do you deal with that? So I just chose to vote for these guys, and I chose to be on my slippery slope and acknowledge that other people were on theirs.
Yeah.
I don't know how you solve it. I'm starting to think that Bonds and Clemens aren't going to make it on the vote of writers, and maybe they'll get in the Veterans Committee or some other way, but it's probably going to be a while for them.
Yeah, I always just wonder about, I mean, Bonds obviously had a great career when he was a skinny little guy too. He was a great baseball player. I just wonder, like, how many of those home runs are 5 feet shorter or 10 feet shorter because of steroids? And I don't know. I don't know.
You don't know. And then, obviously there are some guys who did steroids who weren't very successful at all.
True.
In 1993, okay, if we're going to use the eye test, Barry Bonds was thin as a rail. He hit 46 home runs that year.
Yeah, that's true.
And,
that's true.
He was an unbelievable player. Obviously a very turbulent personality, but and I witnessed that. I had a front row seat for that. But I felt like that he's the best hitter I ever saw. And I felt like he's a Hall of Famer. I felt Roger Clemens was a Hall of Famer. And so that's why I voted. That's the criteria that I used to vote for these guys. But has the vote been as much fun as I thought it would be? No, not really.
Yeah.
But because there's just no way it can be, because we're not gonna reach an agreement on this. We're not.
No.
We're not. And so then the way I looked at it is I take it seriously, and then I publicize my ballot. And there are some people who still don't, and I don't understand that. I don't understand why you would want to keep your ballot secret. But some people do. And then it's gotten really goofy. Like if Derek Jeter doesn't get in unanimously, then it's the end of the world. And instead of like focusing on all the people who did vote for him, you focus on the tiny people who don't.
Right.
And that's always been the case. Nobody ever got in unanimously. So some of that has been social media driven and hasn't, I don't know that it's really contributed much to the conversation, but the game is still compelling to me. And as long as I have the vote, I'm going to use it.
Yeah. We're talking about like the social media takes and all of that. I wonder, kind of bringing it back more to the writing you do today, more so for the SAC-B and the columns. You write about school boards and school board news, school news, local politics, racism, representation. You get to write about some of the legends like Willie Mays and Cruz Reynoso, who passed away recently. And I always find it to be very down to earth and like you talked about, like affirming and I can get an idea of who you are through your writing. I wonder about the idea of being objective. Do you feel like there are things keeping you from being objective? Is objective a good thing? Like, how much objectivity, subjectivity do you put into your writing?
Well, I mean, it sort of depends on what you mean by objective. I subscribe to the belief that sort of both sidesing it is not really being objective. It's not anything to be really proud of, and is sometimes contributes to a different form of censorship. Where you only put in so much of what Trump did and said, but not all of it. You know what I mean? So there has been an assault on the truth, but those assaults come from the liberal side too. You mentioned the only reason I've written about school issues in Sacramento is that I believe that that public education is the great equalizer, and that access to a good public education is a really important way to take on systemic racism and to bring about equity. And in my opinion, and since I'm an opinion journalist, that's all I can provide is my opinion, is that that the interests of adults are in Sacramento are a lot more important to people than the interests of children. And so that those writing it from that perspective, I have run afoul with liberal activists, and sort of I'll get called like conservative Republican, the Trump lover. And I've been called that when I've written some of this stuff, which is, if anyone who knew me knew that would just be preposterous. And to me, it's like, it really is about being focused on student outcomes, as opposed to being worried about labor peace. And,
Sure.
and then, I mean, I'm the son of a Teamster, I'm the son of a farm worker, so, I just don't want to engage in that false debate, because I feel like the issues that when I write about student outcomes, that's an issue that deserves a lot more attention. And there are some times where you pick topics where they're not going to be popular with the majority of the people who are reading you, and it's going to test their orthodoxy and their alliances and allegiances, and it goes back to what I said earlier, that you can't be afraid of that. And so just like I've really taken on the conservative Republican sheriff of Sacramento County, I've taken off the liberal Democrat teachers union in Sacramento, and I feel like doing that is being honest. Doing that is doing what we're supposed to do, which is to challenge people's ideas. Yeah. Challenge their allegiances. And again, it's not going to win you writing about the teachers union in a negative way in Sacramento is not going to win you a popularity contest. Sure. It's not. Sure. And I just choose not to worry about it.
You wrote pretty close to right after the racist El Paso shooting, and it was a very visceral, very very strong-willed, strongly written piece, and it was beautifully done. It was unfortunate that it was about such an incident. I'm quoting from you here from this article. But more than anything, I've been angry because the cultural hatred that made El Paso possible, and our obsession with using Mexico and Mexicans as convenient scapegoats for our societal ills, have been specters in my life. And this is the lines that really got me here. I see my white colleagues in journalism constantly saying and tweeting, "This isn't who we are." I'm sorry, guys, but it is who we are. This is who we've been for a long time, and this is who we will continue to be until more of us decide to be different.
Yeah, man, and that column was a very difficult one for me to write. One that I talk about being afraid to say these things out loud, but I wrote it anyway. And the thing that really got me in that piece was that you had an assassin who went into a store on U.S. soil, shooting at people who fit a profile, and he killed Americans too. He killed American citizens too. And I'm not even sure if I felt like some of my friends or colleagues got the distinction. I see. That he wasn't just, he was killing, in his twisted mind, killing Mexicans, but it was people who fit a profile. And the same thing happened in California in the 1990s during the Proposition 187 campaign, where, illegals were going to be barred from services, and that campaign was a forerunner to Trumpism and to the hatred that we see playing out on our streets now, and so I never felt like the fact that he gunned down American citizens who happened to be of Mexican ancestry ever got the attention that it deserved, because it spoke to how it spoke to how, even though people will say politically, well, this is about illegals. No, it's not. It's about people who fit a profile. Right. And sooner or later, the attention turns to legal citizens as well. Sooner or later, it did in California, and it did during the Trump era, and so I felt that that this shooting was the manifestation of decades of public discourse that made it possible, and that this one guy acted on it. And I want to tell you, I didn't have a single colleague of mine say to me, "How are you doing?" how are you? It just didn't register, and that was a very personal piece for me. And I don't say that I'm not seeking sympathy. I'm saying that when you write these pieces, that sometimes you're not going to hear what you think you should hear, but that should not deter you from writing it in the first place. And so I wrote it, and I'm not sure how many people read it, but to me that was an important moment in our country, and it really crystallized the danger and the power of hate speech, and how it can impact people, and how when an entire ethnicity becomes villainized. So it's what happened, and we seem to have moved on from that. But those forces have not gone away.
No.
And we're still in that space where I think that I think that people are in danger of being on the receiving end of someone's hatred that started off as a political wedge issue. And I think that's been my experience, and I think that it's a danger going forward, I think, for all of us, that we have to be aware of. And it's not even so much the person who would pick up the weapon, or the person who would be happy that the person picked up the weapon. It's the bystanders. It's the people who see this and don't like fully acknowledge what it is, which is profiling and targeting people who look and behave a certain way, or who come from a certain place. And that's what happened in that case. And I hope it never happens again.
Yeah, I mean, important is the word. Is a very important article, and better than anyone else, words matter. When, like you said, when people have been using these words for 20, 30, 40 years or centuries to talk about certain groups, what do you expect to happen,
Yeah, what do you expect to happen? And that's the thing that worries me the most going forward, is if we don't reach a point where we acknowledge that kind of hate speech can lead to a deadly outcome, then it'll happen again. I don't know, maybe I talked myself into thinking somehow that that these sorts of things were behind us, but clearly they're not.
No.
Clearly they're not.
No. I mean, you've had such a breadth of articles and things you've written on. It's hard to fully represent that, but I'll definitely post, that article and a couple others. One is from, I guess, 5 days ago or so. You had a nice tribute to Yvonne Walker leaving the SEIU. Quote, "A leader we haven't appreciated enough." She is quoted as saying, "I had the audacity to be a Black woman with a voice." And you wrote about, about how she did have that audacity, how she worked for the good and with all the obstacles she had in her way. So, quite a body of work that you have. I wonder what's next. Again, congratulations on the new title. You're now, what do you see yourself working on in the near future or the distant future?
Well, so now it's part of my job to be not just focused on Sacramento, but on California. And just before I came on with you today, I was talking to some of my colleagues in some of our other markets, Fresno, Modesto, San Luis Obispo, and we're going to attempt to be a team of opinion writers in California who bring compelling perspectives to our readers. And so I really feel like climate change, what we're experiencing right now, our drought, our inequality in schools, our inability to create enough housing for people to live are all taking place amid just unbelievable wealth and affluence. And we're in a moment in California where we have to decide who we're going to be, and I worry about the future California that my children are going to grow up in. So I think it's our responsibility as opinion journalists and based in Sacramento to write about those issues and to really challenge our perceptions and to really try to get at why it's so hard or next to impossible to create enough housing where young people can live, where workers can live. I don't know if I could buy a house now. So it's all these things are foremost in my mind, and they're going to be subject matter for me and for the people who work with me.
Mm-hmm. Well, again, thanks so much. It's so cool to be able to talk to you in person, quote unquote, being that I've read you for so long and really appreciated your work. And I know you do a lot of great things in the community with, is it St. Baldrick's? Is that the?
Yes, so I did that where I shaved my head and raised money for pediatric cancer. I've had many members of my family who've passed away from cancer, and so that is a major effort for me. I mean, literacy is going to be a major effort for me with my experience now in our school district and not having our kids ready to compete when they graduate from high school. So all those things are really important, and I'm going to try to do my best with them.
Yeah, I wish you continued great luck. I again appreciate writers like you who don't just write about yourself for fame and fortune, but you write about issues and societal ills and how to change things and all of that. So thanks again for your time. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for listening to episode 75 with Marcos Bretón. You can now subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts. Please leave a 5-star review. You can also ask for it by name using Alexa and find it on Stitcher, Spotify, and on Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, one word, or on Twitter where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. And go ahead and follow Marcos Bretón on Twitter as well. You can watch other episodes on YouTube, this one as well. Watch and subscribe to the Chills at Will podcast channel. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation. I'd love your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look at an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down instrumental version. And the other song played on this episode is Hoops, instrumental by Matt Whitehour, and both songs are used through archesaudio.com. I look forward to sharing with you on August 27th, my episode with Danielle Fuentes Morgan of Santa Clara University, who has written about satire in the African-American community. For now, thanks for listening, and I hope that these summer or these quarantine days bring you texts and articles by writers with mad skills like Marcos Bretón, whose work gives you chills at